In the recent London Chess Classic, we saw once again the effectiveness of the Berlin defense of the Spanish. Now let me just show you those moves. So e4, e5, and now here's the Spanish, and now knight f6, that's the Berlin defense. In 6 games, 5 were drawn and black won 1 of them. Now, for a black opening, that is a pretty good record. At the moment, it's difficult for white to prove an advantage against the Berlin. So I've been looking around, looking at some old games to try to find perhaps a way of playing against this opening. And I've been looking at some games of Bobby Fischer. I thought he might be a good man to emulate. Fischer faced the Berlin on 3 occasions and scored 2.5 out of 3. First occasion was in the 1958 Portoroz interzonal tournament. Fischer was just 15 years old, but it wasn't a very effective line that he found against it. Let me just show you that game very quickly. Fischer played castles. The pawn was taken on e4. He played d4, and this is the main move, and now knight d6, a very curious move, but it's the main line. The problem is that white's bishop is attacked, and, well, black is still a pawn up, so white should take on c6. And this is still the main line. And now queen takes d8 is the main line here. But on this occasion, in this first game against the Berlin, Fischer played queen e2. Now the idea is to play rook d1 to hit the queen very quickly. By the way, this was against Nykirch, who's a Bulgarian player. And this was the very first round of this interzonal tournament. Nykirch played the theoretically best move, knight d4. And after this, actually, black has no problems at all because he can blockade very, very easily on these light squares. And in fact, the game was agreed drawn fairly quickly. Here, white has absolutely no opening advantage. Okay, there's a theoretical advantage of these kingside pawns, 4 against 3 majority, but black can blockade very, very easily on these squares. And in this position, the players actually agree to draw opposite colour bishops. In fact, here, not even a structural advantage. So not an effective debut by Fischer against the Berlin. Now a few years later in 1963 he had to face the Berlin again, and this time he was better prepared. Now this was in the last round of the US Championship 1962-1963 against Arthur Bisgeier, who, well, made a speciality out of the Berlin defense actually. And here Fischer played the endgame, as we've seen in many, many games recently, and it's also a very old variation, of course. And Fischer played a very direct method, well, typically for Fischer. He swung his knight around to the king side, looking at some key squares here on e6 and h5. Now here, in recent times, black has played b6, h6 and knight e7. But Bisgeier played kind of an old move, bishop e6. Fischer played knight f4 and Bisgeier played bishop d5. Well, this is actually not a bad way for black to play. Black is already threatening to take on f3, so white should really take on d5. And you can see already that black has straightened out his pawns on the queen side. And, well, although Fischer ploughed forward here on the king side, actually, I think black should be alright here. Now, why did Fischer play in this way? Well, going back to that interzonal tournament from 1958, there was actually a game between Fischer's opponent Nykirch and Gligorich. Gligorich had the white pieces. And here Nykirch played c5. But this proved to be a mistake because this d-pawn was lacking support. Remember, black's king cannot castle here. Castle's queenside might be a good move. But very quickly we can see that Gligorich had built up pressure He was about to build up pressure on this d pawn, and white is already better. So I think Fischer clearly had this game in mind when he played against Bisgeier, 5 years later. But Bisgeier improved. Instead of playing c5, he played the rock-solid c6. And I don't think Fischer has any real advantage in this position. Let's see how the game progressed. Fischer still managed to win, as we'll see. And now bishop c5. What Fischer really needs to do is force through f4 and f5 very quickly. But this is difficult, as we'll see. For example, if he tries king g2, well, I think that's the move I would start with. h5 is a useful move for black. It means he can always try to get counterplay on the h file. Now knight f8, I think this is a good move. I repeat, this is not how the game continued. I'm just showing you what happens if white plays very directly. Now let's say knight h4 to try to advance the kingside majority. Now the problem is that in this position white is unable to play f4 because black will take and play knight takes f4 check, and you can see that the knight is hanging on h4. You can see how important it is to gain counterplay with h5. So Fischer had to change tack, and he played c3. And after this knight regrouping, this is, I think, a very nice way to play for black, blockading on e6. Fischer started advancing on the queen side. Okay, now Fischer tried this knight h4 idea, but I don't think it's terribly effective. Bisgeier took and played g6. Okay, good idea to keep the knight locked out of f5. Fischer tried rook h1. Now that's a very tricky move, and Bisgeier fell for Fischer's trap actually. In this position, Bisgeier should connect his rooks with king d7. That's protecting the rooks. And here, well, I think it's difficult for Fischer to make progress. If f4, then unfortunately, although the knight is protected, g5 is a good move, breaking up the pawns. And after this, well, I can't imagine that white has any real advantage at all, not when the knight can come into e4. So I think probably after king d7, rook, simply moving the rook back to d1 is a reasonable move. I mean, maybe the a rook could go there as well. Trying to perhaps target the king, maybe looking at playing one of these moves later, but I really don't believe that white has any advantage in this position. But instead, Bisgeier fell for the trap. He played bishop d8. Who knows, maybe Fischer was playing at his legendary speed, putting pressure on his opponent. Bishop d8 is a big mistake. Here's the move, knight f5, very clever indeed. So the rook is on prise, and after Bisgeier took on h1, Fischer throws in this in-between move, knight d6 check, this intermezzo. So the king gets out of check, and then Fischer recaptures. Now, the position, just in the space of those two moves, has transformed. The knight is on a brilliant square on d6, and suddenly we are ready to advance this wall of pawns down the board, and this will push the knight away, push black's pieces away, and even black's king is in trouble here. Let's see how Fischer finished it off. Okay, the pawn was on prise, and now here we go. This beautiful pawn stall, pushing away black's pieces. And now a great move from Fischer coming now. e6. The point is that after f takes e6, bishop e5 is absolutely crushing, threatening a rook h8 mate, and black is in dire trouble. So Bisgeier played f6, but white still has a really powerful attack, not to mention this protected passed pawn on e6. yeah, this is a really strong attack actually. Because after this, after bishop f4, Fischer is threatening rook check, followed by bishop h6 mate. So that practically forced g5. But now Fischer has total security, because this pawn chain really can't be touched. And now he cruised in. After this, the knight came here, and the c-pawn drops, and Fischer is in total control in this position. This guy actually sacked piece back. Well, there's nothing for him to do here, and in this position he resigned. In the end, a convincing victory for Fischer, but only because Bisguy fell for this trick. And, well, I think Fischer's opening was interesting, but not really a success. 6 months later, Fischer had to face the Berlin defence again, but he had something else prepared, something else up his sleeve. And we'll take a look at that game next week. Thanks for watching, and yeah, stay tuned to my YouTube channel.